Hey everybody. The other day I shot a video talking about angelfish being good beginner fish, and I got a lot of interesting comments about what people think constitutes a beginner fish keeper and what people think constitutes a sort of beginner setup, and of course people talked about what they thought their idea of a beginner fish was. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a beginner fish keeper, and I got to thinking about it a little while ago, and I definitely don't consider myself a beginner anymore. But I honestly could not tell you the point where I stopped feeling like a beginner. There was no real pivotal moment where I suddenly felt like, okay, I've accomplished this whatever, and I now am in there and I'm now a fish keeper, I just sort of one day kind of realized, like, I've been doing this for a while and I'm kind of good at it, and I've been keeping these tanks up and running for a while, and I just kind of realized I'm not really a beginner anymore. But I still stick with really basic fish keeping. There's an old saying that if you never get away from the basics, then you never have to get back to the basics, because getting back to the basics is what a lot of people tend to do at some point in whatever hobby they've gotten themselves involved in, because they've overcomplicated it, it's gotten less fun or whatever, and they have to get back to the basics. I've never really left the basics, but being basic isn't the same as being a beginner. And that's where it gets kind of, where do you draw that line between what is a beginner and what is not? Obviously, there's a time factor. If you've been doing it for 5 or 6 years, then you're not a beginner simply by virtue of the fact that you've been doing it for a length of time. But how much experience have you acquired in that 5 years? Have you kept one, fish alive in a tank by itself for that entire 5 years, and you don't really even understand how the nitrogen cycle works? You may not be a beginner, but you're certainly not a well-educated, seasoned fish keeper either. So it's kind of a weird distinction to talk about beginner or anything. And one of the comments that really got me thinking about this was somebody suggested that beginner fish are considered beginner fish based more on their size than anything. Fish that fit in smaller tanks would be considered a beginner fish. Fish that are larger would go into, larger tanks, and they would be for, more seasoned fish keepers. And I even pointed out in my video that try not to conflate small with beginner. And when it comes to the idea that beginner fish are smaller fish, I can think of a lot of fish right off the top of my head. Hillstream loaches, for example, are definitely not beginner fish, but they don't get very big. There's a lot of little nano fish out there that are very particular little fish. And a point that I forgot to make in my other video was that it's easier to maintain a larger aquarium. So the beginner fish keeper is better off getting a 55 than they are starting with a 10. Managing a 10-gallon aquarium is more challenging and difficult than a 55. The water parameters, it's so small an amount of water, the slightest little shift can really have big implications in that tiny little amount of water. A 55 is much more forgiving for the beginner who's prone to make mistakes. So that was another thing that came up. Fish that are tolerant of mistakes that new fish keepers are going to make, and I personally include angelfish in that category. Angelfish, in my experience, are tough as nails. They are not delicate, sensitive fish. They can handle a wide range of water. They can handle swings in water. An inexperienced fish keeper may do large water changes and not realize they're shifting their pH or they're shifting their water hardness. All that kind of stuff does come with time and experience. So having fish that can tolerate big swings in pH and water hardness and stuff because of the new fish keeper, the beginner, is going to be doing these kind of things and making these sorts of mistakes, if you will, and the fish need to be able to tolerate that. I'm all on board with that, and again, that's why I talk about angelfish. I believe angelfish are capable of dealing with those kinds of swings. They're just tough as nails. They really are. So the other thing, again, I already touched on the tank size, the sensitivity. The other thing that I would think about, that I would categorize as beginner fish, is ease of care. Can you just toss them in a tank and they'll just sort of live in whatever conditions, whether you've got some plastic plants or a bare bottom tank? Will they eat any old prepared fish food that you throw in there? Or is it a fish that needs a really particular environment, not only sensitive to water conditions, but sensitive to environmental conditions? Is the tank too bright? Is there not enough cover, not enough hiding places? very particular with certain kinds of tank mates. These kinds of things would bring challenges to a new fish keeper. Fish that would need a very particular diet, fish that can only eat live food or only eat meat-based diets or only can eat plant-based diets or whatever. These might be things that would take a fish out of that beginner category, because a beginner's not necessarily going to know how to cultivate their own live food, or, you know, that's not always going to be convenient. But having your little jar of flakes and maybe some algae wafers and stuff, again, that's beginner kind of stuff. A fish that will just accept whatever food you give it. And that's why I still, you know, I talk about my stuff being sort of everyday stuff. I don't really have any of those complicated fish. I have a few, but they're not really outside the realm. They're the fish that would fall into that sort of upper beginner, lower intermediate level fish keeper. My tenopoma here is one of them. It kind of a funny diet. You obviously can't keep smaller fish with it. My puffer is another one that needs certain water conditions and has a particular diet. Other than that, I don't have any fish that are real fussy. I will also point out that when I looked at the lists of beginner fish, I did a little research before I did my last video about angelfish being good beginner fish, and all of the lists that I looked at included fish that I wouldn't consider to be good beginner fish. Like Oscars came up a lot. I don't think an Oscar is necessarily a good beginner fish. I think of that as almost kind of a specialty fish. It's got to have a certain kind of conditions. They're big, they're aggressive, but Oscars come up a lot on beginner fish, and goldfish is another one. Goldfish is one of those, some people think they're good beginner fish and they have fair arguments for it. I'm not gonna, you know, in my opinion, they're not. I don't think goldfish are particularly good beginner fish, partially because I think they do need more specialized sort of habitat than a square tank. Goldfish like koi or swimmers, and maybe it's not as big a deal as it is with koi, but keeping them in squared tanks is not necessarily a good idea. And they get big. Even your basic standard carnival goldfish that comes in the little bag that you won with your little ping pong game, those can get 10, 12, 14 inches eventually and need a large tank. Again, I personally don't think goldfish are good beginner fish for those reasons. They get, but see, again, they're easy to care for, and just because they get big doesn't necessarily mean they're not a good beginner fish. The reason goldfish aren't good beginner fish is because of the way people are portrayed as caring for them. They think they can put them in a little bowl and they'll just be fine, like a betta fish, and I don't even think you should put a little betta fish in a bowl. Just because it can survive that way doesn't mean it should. And so the misunderstanding about goldfish, the not realizing they live for decades and they get huge, that's what takes goldfish out of that realm of beginner fish for me. If people understood that about goldfish and they went into it knowing within a few years this is going to be a very large fish, that would be a different story. In that case, goldfish are pretty easy to care for and pretty hardy, and you know, they make decent good beginner fish. Plecos is another one. Common plecos, they get enormous. They're great beginner fish because they're tough as nails and they do a good job keeping your tank clean, and you can keep one long enough that if you bought it when you were a beginner, by the time it's starting to get big and problematic, you won't really be a beginner anymore. Of course, you'll also be stuck with the fish that's rapidly outgrowing its small tank that you put it in. But anyway, I just, you know, again, I just don't really know where I would draw that line between where you're no longer a beginner, where the fish doesn't really count as a beginner fish anymore. But I think some basic parameters for a beginner fish is easy to care for, hardy, can withstand a wide variety of conditions, can also tolerate a wide shift in conditions, because it's important. A beginner may not know what kind of water hardness or whatever they're putting the fish in, but they're also probably not going to know how much they're shifting all that stuff when they do big water changes. So not only does it need to be able to go in pretty much anybody's water, it also needs to be able to tolerate big shifts in that water. And of course, it needs to be able to eat pretty much whatever prepared foods you just throw in there that you buy at your local fish store, and it should be able to readily accept them. So those are what I would consider to be a beginner type fish, and the size of it and how big it gets is not so much of a factor for me as just ease of care, hardiness, ease of feeding it, you know, resilience from water changes, that sort of thing. So as always, I will say leave your 2 cents down below. below. I'd love to hear your comments. Make sure you're subscribed. Don't forget to check out my other channel, Dan's Outdoors and More. I do memberships now, and I will be doing live streams every Friday and Sunday from now on, tonight being an exception. I was not ready to do a live stream tonight being Sunday, but from now on I will be doing a live stream on Friday night. Will be open discussion, and Sunday night will be a topic discussion. So we'll figure out what next week's topic's going to be during the week. You can check out my community tab, and I will put all the details in there as we move along. So thanks again for watching this one. Make sure you're subscribed, ring that bell so you don't miss any notifications, and I'll see you real soon in the next one.